There are two things that come to mind when I consider the canticle of Zechariah. The first is to note why Zechariah's lips were sealed in the first place. As it happens, the angel Gabriel brought a promise from God, and Zechariah questioned whether that promise was possible. I've always found it odd that the presence of an angel was somehow believable, but yet birth in old age was not. I don't quite know what was going on in Zechariah's mind at that moment, but anyway, Zechariah was struck mute, as I said, and he couldn't say a word until he named his son John, and then he fairly burst into song. The second thing, of course, is to note when his tongue finally is released, what he said. Of John, he said, "And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation to his people, by the forgiveness of their sins. By the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace." This time of year, our minds turn to peace, do they not? I wonder sometimes, though, if we particularly need words such as Zechariah spoke now. There does seem to be a lot of fear in the world sometimes. Of course, that would have been true of Zechariah's world as well. Oftentimes, what is said in the face of fear is neither helpful nor useful. But nonetheless, it takes a certain amount of courage to open one's mouth. It really takes courage to open your mouth when what is to be said might cause dyspepsia at the Christmas dinner table. But God does not call us to fear. God calls us to courage. Courage in light of the promises of God. You see, to know the heart of God is to know how God relates to what God has made. The story of the Bible as it unfolds is the story of God's tender mercy to what God has made, and it is also the story of God keeping the promises God makes. Because once a promise has been broken, why would you ever expect that person to tell you the truth? In the unfolding of the story, God makes promises over and over again. After the flood, God makes a covenant, never to despair of humankind to the point of wiping the slate clean in that way ever again. And 20th century theologian Karl Barth says this is the defining moment of God, where God decides forevermore and irrevocably to be on the side of humankind. And then God, in order to live into the fullness of this promise, calls one family, Abraham and Sarah. And God calls them to a new way of life, a way of life following God, and by the manner of their lives, making known to everyone whom they encounter something about who this God they follow is. And God promises to be with them, to bring them into the land, and to give them offspring, and to shower them with blessings. Genesis is the story of the keeping of that particular promise. And then God makes another promise. When the descendants of Abraham and Sarah were enslaved under the heels of the Egyptians, God decided to save them. God called Moses, and Moses, after some fits and starts, a lesson to us all, led God's people with his sister and his brother into the freedom of the promised land. And along the way, God makes yet another promise. God promises to be the God of this whole people, and through their collective life together, their common life together, to show the world something of who God is. And so to seal this covenant, God gives the law, the 10 Commandments, we might say. We see this covenant lived out over and over again. Exodus through Deuteronomy are the stories of God keeping that promise. Over and over again we see God makes a promise, and then sometimes through extraordinary efforts, God keeps the promise that God has made. The collection of the stories of these promises comprise the Torah. We call it the law. That's really not an accurate translation. It is the law, but that suggests law in the sense that we understand it in our modern context. But the law really is a promise. It's a promise from God to be the God of the people and to show the people how to live together so that their common life together enriches the world. The law of God is about much more than rules. It's about building a common life together. And so, as such, the Talmud teaches that the Torah has 2 dimensions. They are salvation and obligation, story and stipulation. As the rabbis considered these dimensions of faithfulness to the law, they came up with 2 words to characterize faithfulness to God. They are Haggadah and Halakha. Haggadah is the obligation to tell the story, and Halakha is the obligation to go in the way of God. The whole Bible is the story of the tender mercy of our God, working God's way from promise to promise until finally in the coming of Jesus Christ, we are grafted into those promises that God has already made and already fulfilled. And so just like the ancient Hebrews, our calling then is also to tell the story and to go in the way of God. Paul gets that when he writes to the Philippians, "This is my prayer, that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight to help you to determine what is best, so that in the day of Christ you may be pure and blameless, having produced a harvest of righteousness that comes from Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God." Haggadah and Halakha. Telling the story and going in the way of God. But telling the story can be frightening. It can call for from us things we might not know that we are called to give. Speaking the truth can be terrifying. Speaking the truth can have consequences. Listen to the story that New Testament scholar Brian Blunt shares about the consequences of faithfulness as he recounts the story of a would-be slave preacher by the name of James Smith. Blunt writes, "He was finally received into the church and baptized. Not long after this, he felt loudly called upon to go out and labor for the salvation of souls among the slave population with whom he was identified. At this conduct, his master was much displeased and strove to prevent him from the exercise of what the slave considered to be his duty to God and to his brethren on the Sabbath day. He was sometimes kept tied all day Sundays, while the other slaves were allowed to go just where they pleased on that day. At other times he was flogged until his blood would drip down at his feet, and yet he would not give up laboring wherever he could get an opportunity on the Sabbath day for the conversion of souls. God was pleased to bless his efforts, and many were led to embrace the Savior under his preaching." At length, Brian says, his master sold him to a slave trader who separated him from his family and carried him to the state of Georgia. His parting words to his wife were that if they proved faithful to God, God would bring them together again in a more free land than Virginia. Speaking the truth can have deep consequences. Haggadah and halakha, telling the story and going in the way of God. These two words comprise the heart of our common life together. Indeed, they are the heart of our sacramental common life together, as we are reminded of God's promises lived out together. Our common life together is at its heart the trust that God will be God and that God will be God for us. It is the belief that God will keep promises. That's why so often our worship includes the sacrament of the Lord's Supper and the sacrament of baptism, to be reminded always of the promises of God and that God will keep them. Sometimes we have to look around to see the evidence of God's promise-keeping in effect. I am reminded of a story from a number of years ago. I was walking into a Presbytery committee meeting, and I will readily admit that I was not in a particularly good mood as I walked into this meeting. And I will tell you, I am a deep believer in the principle of presbytery, but this was a business meeting, and I expected it to have all of the spiritual vitality of a business meeting, which is to say that I didn't come in with any great expectation that in this meeting I would encounter examples of moral courage. But as our committee met, we had with us this particular day a pastor who had come from Cuba to bring us greetings from the Presbyterian Church there. He shared that he is the pastor of 3 congregations and 2 missions. Sundays, he said, were an exercise in mobility and flexibility, beginning with breakfast at one church, lunch at the next, concluding with dinner on the third, and in the week in between, he would visit the 2 missions associated with the 3 congregations that he served. It was important because this was the first time this minister had been able to bring greetings to the Presbyterian Church in the United States. So he concluded his meeting with us by saying this: before, our countries were not friendly, but now they are friendly, and I can be with you, and so I ask for your prayers. There are many changes going on, so many changes. We don't know what is going to happen next. Our economy is bad. So now I am with you, and I tell you my story, and all I ask from you as we seek to remain faithful in Cuba is your prayers. Our common life together calls us to live with witness to the faithfulness of God, to the promises God has made, to tell the story and to go in the way of God. Another time, when I was living in Georgia, a pastor friend of mine came to visit my congregation, and she said, surely you have seen all of the press coverage on refugees coming into this country. It's pretty much impossible to miss, and I'm sure that you all remember that right around the corner from where we sit right now is the most diverse square mile in the entire United States, because Clarkston, Georgia, is where a great number of refugees from all over the world come to settle because there is a chicken processing plant there, and they can get jobs. But, she said, what you may not know is that for years and years, the Presbyterian Church has had wonderful, effective ministries and missionaries in Burma, which is now called Myanmar. And she went on. And so, when these refugees come in from Burma, they get off the bus and they see the Presbyterian Church in Clarkston, and they say, oh, Presbyterians, it's so good to see some family. Telling the story, going in the way of God. That is what it is to live with faithfulness to the promises that God keeps to us. In fact, it is as clear a sign of a common life together as I can imagine. God is calling you, and God is calling me to tell the story and to go in the way of God. That calling has no expiration date on it. It is as true for us now as it was for the ancient Hebrews then. Haggadah and Halakha. Tell the story. Go in the way of God. Now, God calls us to courage, and God calls us to tell the story, and God calls us to go in God's ways, but I want to be really clear about what that means, because what that means is different for each of us to a certain extent. God is not calling you to live my calling, and God is not calling me to live your calling. And what I mean by that is that each of us have gifts that God has given us for the purpose of our life together, and we're called to use them. But I can't think of any more perfect way to be absolutely miserable than to attempt to live someone else's calling. The calling that God calls you to is unique to you. God is probably not calling you to be a pastor in Cuba, but God is calling you to pray for that pastor in Cuba. And I truly, deeply hope that none of us will ever be refugees, but God does call us to bear with refugees. And I am not called to be a slave preacher. I don't know what it is to be a slave preacher, but I do know this, that God is calling me to bear witness to the words and to the ministry of that particular slave preacher and his faithfulness to what God called him to do, to tell the story, and to go in the way of God. No, I'm fairly certain there is no better way to be absolutely miserable than to attempt to live somebody else's calling. But our common life together calls each of us to be faithful to the calling that God has placed in our lives, and to bring the fullness of our being to the living out of that calling. Living into your calling, living courageously into the fullness of what God calls you to do and to be, is the place that we will be, is the way that we find our place where, in the words of Frederick Buechner, the world's deep hunger and your deep gladness meet. That is the place to which God calls you. I love a story that Anne Lamott tells about setting up a Sunday school in the church she attends in San Francisco for the benefit of one child, her own son. She begins her story this way. I did not mean to help start a Sunday school, and I did not have a speck of confidence that I could do so. She writes, I have only mediocre self-esteem when I am doing things that I am good at or that don't require any self-esteem. I grow anxious on my way to the dump with a car full of garbage, convinced that my garbage and I will be rejected, either because I am throwing out perfectly good stuff or because it is so disgusting that the people who run a dump wouldn't want it. That is a special variety of insecurity. She then goes on to tell the progression of her journey. And friends, if you have ever been involved in the creation of a new program in a church, you can write this story. You could write of the anxieties of not thinking you knew enough about what needed to be done. You could write of the frustrations that arise when volunteers don't emerge, or goldfish run out at an inopportune time, or crises of confidence that leave you wondering if everyone in the church is questioning your competence at that given moment. Now, new programs are absolutely not for the faint of heart. But when she had chronicled her journey and the successes and failures along the way, she ended with this story that captures the heart of what we share with the whole world when we live our common life together, our sacramental life together, bearing witness to the promises of God. She writes of the day she took her Sunday school class to the beach. The kids went in. They yelped as the cold water covered them, and they splashed and screamed and shoved one another a little more roughly than they had in my dream of this day. Still, as I watched them being cuffed by the breaking waves, submerged, missing for a moment, then reappearing, spluttering and laughing, I thought of what this dream had taken. All those times we teachers had to ask for help and plugged away without nearly enough resources, without knowing how or whether we were going to manage. It had taken much more letting go and trusting than we had felt capable of. I remember getting knocked around in these waves when I was young, and how it felt when grown-ups picked you up and tossed you into the air or into the water, exciting and scary all at once, and you knew that you would always be caught. That is what it is to live into the promises of God. It is to live our lives in the knowledge that we will always be caught. And in that knowledge, to be freed to live the life that God calls us to live. To seek that place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So in service of that calling, by the tender mercy of our God, may all of our lips be opened. May we tell the story and go in the way of God.